Some men break when they find out their wife's been screwing another man. I didn't break, I got even. My name's Randall Norton. I spent 30 years chasing killers through the streets of Chicago, watching good men go bad and bad men get away with it. I retired 2 years ago, traded in my badge for a PI license, but old habits die hard. You spend that long sifting through lies, you get a feel for them. You hear them in the way someone hesitates mid-sentence, see them in how they look away too fast, how their hands get a little too still. And lately, I was seeing a whole lot of that in my wife. Valerie and I had been married for 20 years. We had the routine down, morning coffee, half-hearted small talk, me leaving first, her staying a little longer, fussing over her makeup before heading to her office downtown. That's how it always was. Until one day, it wasn't. It started with small things. A shift in her voice when she answered my questions. A little too careful. Like she was rehearsing before she spoke. She started dressing different, looser clothes, more effort into her hair on some days, none at all on others. And then there were the nights she worked late. I'd seen it all before. Hell, I'd tailed enough cheating spouses to write a damn manual. But when it's your own wife, it's different. It's not some scumbag you're watching from the front seat of a rusted-out sedan. It's the woman you shared a bed with. The one who used to look at you like you mattered. One night, she came home past 11, her hair a little messy, her perfume worn off but the scent of expensive cologne still lingering on her. Not mine. Work ran late, she said, dropping her bag by the door. She didn't meet my eyes. That right? I asked, taking a sip of my whiskey. She nodded, walking to the kitchen, avoiding the conversation. Avoiding me. I let it sit. There was no point in calling her out yet. Not without proof. I wasn't some idiot who'd start shouting just to hear his own voice. I'd seen men do that, let their rage get ahead of their logic. And I'd seen how it ended for them. Badly. The next morning, I called up Eddie Vance, my go-to guy for anything digital. Skinny as a rail, always in a hoodie, permanently attached to a can of Monster. He picked up on the second ring. Randall. It's too early for this, he said. It's almost 10, I said. Like I said, too early. I ignored him. Need you to check something for me. Phone records, emails? Quietly. Eddie let out a long sigh. Tell me it's not your wife. I said nothing. Shit, he muttered. All right. Send me her number. Give me a few hours. While he worked his magic, I did what I did best. I watched. Valerie's movements, her calls, how she held her phone a little tighter now, how she stepped outside when she took certain calls. She wasn't sloppy, not yet, but no one's careful forever. That night, she got another message. I was sitting in my chair, flipping through an old case file, and I heard it, the subtle ding of a notification followed by the quick way she flipped her phone over. I looked at her. Something important? She hesitated, then forced a small smile. Just work stuff. That right? She nodded. I let it go. For now. 2 days later, Eddie called. You're not gonna like this. Just tell me. He sighed. She's been talking to someone. A lot. Calls, texts, some encrypted stuff too. Who? Name's William Lancaster. Goes by Bill. Owns a few businesses downtown. Real estate, investments, that kind of thing. Old money. Likes control. I'd heard of him. Knew his type. Men like that didn't ask for things, they took them. I clenched my jaw. Where's she meeting him? Mostly hotels. Nice ones. The kind with suites bigger than our apartments. He paused. Look, man, I know you. You don't know shit, I cut in. Just keep digging. Eddie sighed but didn't argue. Fine. I'll send you everything I've got. I hung up and sat in the dark for a while, the hum of the city outside my window. I'd spent my life solving other people's problems, untangling their messes. Now I was looking at my own and I wasn't about to play the victim. I wasn't gonna yell. I wasn't gonna beg. And I sure as hell wasn't gonna break. I was gonna handle this the way I handled everything else. With patience. With planning. And when I was done, neither of them would see it coming. I spent the next few days gathering my own proof, keeping my routine the same, letting Valerie think I was the same old husband, too tired to notice. Meanwhile, Eddie fed me more details. Times. Locations. Phone logs. It painted a clear picture, meetings at high-end hotels, calls that lasted just long enough to mean something, bank statements that showed she wasn't paying for a damn thing. Bill Lancaster had money and he used it like a net, reeling her in with expensive dinners, jewelry, whatever it took to make her feel special. I'd seen the type before. He didn't care about her, not really. She was just something to collect, like a bottle of scotch or another overpriced car. Friday night, she got dressed like she used to when we were younger. Black dress, hair done, perfume I hadn't smelled on her in years. I was sitting in my chair, half watching the game, a beer sweating in my hand. Going somewhere? I asked without looking up. She hesitated. Dinner with the girls. I nodded slowly, tapping my fingers against the bottle. That right? She shifted on her feet. Yeah. Lisa's birthday. Lisa was a woman she hadn't spoken to in months. But I just gave a small grunt, like I wasn't paying attention. She lingered a second longer, maybe waiting for a fight. But when I didn't give her one, she left. I let a few minutes pass, then grabbed my coat and keys. Eddie had already pinged her location. The Drake Hotel, one of those places that smelled like money the second you stepped inside. I parked a block away, took my time walking in. No one gives a second look to an old detective in a trench coat. I was just another tired man at the bar. I ordered a whiskey neat and watched the elevators. 10 minutes later, Valerie stepped out of one, her hand slipping out of Bill Lancaster's arm as they walked toward the restaurant. He was everything I expected, sharp suit, silver hair slicked back, the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. I could see it in the way he held himself, the way he touched the small of her back like she was his now. I didn't move, just watched, let it sink in. I could walk over, throw a punch, make a scene. But that's what a desperate man would do. And I wasn't desperate. Instead, I left, called Eddie on the way out. You want to hit him now or later? Eddie asked like we were talking about a card game. Later, I said, lighting a cigarette. I want to do this right. I went home and poured myself another drink. Sat in the quiet. I thought about all the men I'd seen break when they found out the truth. The ones who begged, the ones who got violent. None of them came out on top. That wasn't going to be me. The next morning, I started making moves. First stop was Valerie's job. I knew her boss, Karen Faulkner, from a case a few years back. Tough woman. No patience for bullshit. I caught her as she was stepping out for lunch. Randall, she said, raising an eyebrow. Didn't think I'd see you again. I gave a small nod. Need a minute of your time. She studied me, then gestured to a corner table at the cafe nearby. Once we sat, I slid a folder across to her. She opened it, eyes scanning the photos inside. Valerie and Bill at the hotel, the texts Eddie had pulled, the proof that Valerie had been using her work trips for something else. Karen's face didn't change. You bringing this to me as a husband or as a PI? She asked, closing the folder. Both, I said. You do what you want with it, but if I were you, I wouldn't want this mess in my office. She let out a breath, tapping her fingers against the folder. That's cold, Randall. I sipped my coffee. Yeah. She didn't argue, just slid the folder into her bag. Consider it handled. I nodded and left. Step 1 done. Step 2 was Bill Lancaster himself. I spent the next few days digging through everything I could find. Business records, tax filings, lawsuits he'd settled quietly. He was clean enough on paper, but I'd been around long enough to know where to look. And it didn't take long to find the cracks. Shady investment deals, political donations that looked a little too strategic, properties owned under different names. I didn't need much, just enough to make his life uncomfortable. Eddie worked fast. Got something for you, he said over the phone a few days later. Nothing major, but it's enough to get him sweating. You want to go public or keep it personal? I thought about it. Public would be easy. Drop the right files in the right hands, let the press tear him apart. But personal was better. Men like Bill Lancaster didn't fear scandal. They feared someone like me showing up at their door. So that's exactly what I did. A week after I first tailed them, I walked into his office building, past the polished floors and glass walls, straight to the receptionist. Mr. Lancaster expecting you? She asked, eyeing me. No, I said, but he'll want to see me. She hesitated, then picked up the phone. A minute later, a tall man in a tailored suit walked over. Bodyguard, probably. Mr. Norton, he said, like he already knew who I was. Come with me. He led me upstairs to an office with a view of the whole damn city. Bill Lancaster sat behind a desk, looking as polished as ever. Mr. Norton, he said smoothly, like we were old friends. To what do I owe the pleasure? I sat without asking. We're gonna have a talk. He smiled, but his eyes were sharp. Is this about Valerie? Because I can assure you, she made her own choices. Yeah, I said. And so did you. He tilted his head. I don't see the problem then. I pulled out a file and placed it on his desk. He didn't open it, but I could tell he wanted to. That's how men like him worked. They needed to be in control. I let him sweat for a second before I leaned in. You walk away from her. Tonight, I said. No more calls, no more meetings, no more gifts. You're done. He chuckled, slow and measured. And if I don't? I smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. Then I make this real inconvenient for you. He studied me, weighing his options. He could fight it, but he knew I'd already done my homework. He wasn't stupid. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, tapping a finger on the desk. Fine. I stood up. Pleasure doing business with you. As I walked out, I knew he'd keep his word. Not because he was an honest man, but because men like him only played the game when they had the advantage. And I'd just taken that away from him. When I got home that night, Valerie was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a letter from her office. I already knew what it said. She'd been let go. Karen hadn't wasted any time. She looked up at me, her eyes tired. You did this. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped the cap off. Yeah. She swallowed hard, fingers tightening around the letter. What now? I took a long sip. Now you pack. Valerie didn't argue. She just sat there, gripping that letter like it was the last thing tethering her to the life she thought she had. I watched her for a second, waiting to see if she'd break, if she'd scream, if she'd try to talk her way out of it. She didn't. Instead, she pushed back her chair, walked down the hall, and started packing. That was fine by me. I stepped outside onto the porch, lit a cigarette, let the cold air settle into my bones. The street was quiet except for the occasional car passing by, headlights cutting through the dark. My gut told me it wasn't over. Women like Valerie, ones who convinced themselves they were the victim even when they were the ones doing the hurting, they didn't just go away clean. But I wasn't worried. I'd already made my move, and I wasn't done yet. The next morning, she was gone. Suitcase, car, a couple of boxes packed into the trunk. She didn't say goodbye, just left her key on the kitchen counter and drove off. I watched from the window, not feeling much of anything. She'd made her choices. Now she had to live with them. I didn't waste time. First thing I did was call Eddie. She's out, I said. You sound real broken up about it, he muttered, voice thick with sleep. I ignored him. Now we move on to Lancaster. Eddie sighed. Figured you'd say that. I got something for you. 10 minutes later, I was in his apartment, standing over his cluttered desk while he pulled up files on his screen. Your boy's got his hands in a lot of pies, he said, scrolling through a list of financial records. Shady real estate deals, offshore accounts, a couple of shell companies that don't seem to do much of anything. Nothing outright illegal, but if someone were to, I don't know, send the right documents to the right people, it could make his life real complicated. I folded my arms. Like who? Eddie smirked. IRS loves this kind of thing. So do state regulators. And I bet some of his competitors wouldn't mind taking a closer look at his business, either. I nodded. Good. Package it up. Make sure it looks clean, like it leaked from someone inside. Eddie cracked his knuckles. On it. I left him to his work and headed to my next stop, Lancaster's office. No appointment this time. I walked right past the receptionist and into his office like I owned the place. He was mid-call, but when he saw me, he muttered a quick, "I'll call you back," and hung up. Mr. Norton, he said, leaning back in his chair, trying to look relaxed. Something I can do for you? You already did, I said, dropping into the chair across from him. You cut her off. Good. Smart. Now you do the same with me. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm not sure what you mean. I leaned forward. I mean, you stay out of my way. You don't try to retaliate. You don't make any quiet little moves to screw with my life. Because if you do, I'll make sure every dirty little secret you've got is laid out for the world to see. His jaw tightened, just a little. You think you can threaten me? Not a threat. I said. Just a fact. He held my stare for a long second, then exhaled through his nose. You really don't know when to quit, do you? I smiled. That's what they used to say when I was on the force. He drummed his fingers against the desk, thinking. I let him. Finally, he nodded once, short and clipped. Fine. I stood. Pleasure doing business with you. By the time I left the building, I already knew I'd won. He wasn't the kind of man who liked mess, and I just handed him a good reason to cut his losses. That night, I got a call from my daughter, Tina. Dad, she said, voice wary. Mom called me. I took a breath, leaning back in my chair. Yeah? She said you ruined her life. I let out a dry laugh. That right? Tina was quiet for a second. Did you? I rubbed a hand over my face. No, kid. She did that all on her own. More silence. Then finally, okay. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I sat there for a while after she hung up, staring at the empty house, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. It was over. The marriage, the lies, the mess of it all. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. I didn't hear from Valerie after that. No messages, no calls. Just silence. Fine by me. I had more important things to focus on. Eddie sent out the files the next morning, one to the IRS, one to a couple of business watchdogs, and one to an anonymous tip line for the Chicago Tribune. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it was only a matter of time before Lancaster felt the heat. A few days later, I was at a diner on the west side, the kind that hadn't changed much since the 80s. Vinyl booths, old jukebox in the corner, coffee that tasted like burnt rubber but did the job. I was halfway through my eggs when Eddie slid into the seat across from me, looking pleased with himself. You're gonna love this, he said, dropping a folded newspaper onto the table. I picked it up, scanned the front page. Nothing. Then I flipped a few pages and there it was, small but loud enough, Chicago developer under investigation for tax irregularities. I set the paper down. That was fast. Eddie shrugged, stealing a strip of my bacon. Turns out some people really hate Lancaster. All I did was point them in the right direction. I sipped my coffee. You do good work. I know. He grinned. And now I'm officially done helping you ruin people's lives because I'm not trying to end up in some rich guy's basement with a bullet in my head. I smirked. Fair enough. Eddie left a few minutes later, and I sat there for a while, watching the world outside the window. I should have felt satisfied. Lancaster was going to be too busy dealing with lawyers and auditors to worry about anything else. Valerie was out of my life, with nothing to fall back on but whatever friends she had left. And me? I was free. But something about it still sat wrong. I paid my bill and headed home, but instead of going inside, I drove a few blocks past my house and pulled up outside a small, single-story place with a blue door and an overgrown front lawn. Tina's place. I sat in the car for a minute, debating. I hadn't exactly been father of the year these past few years. She was grown now, didn't need me, or at least, that's what I told myself. But I'd been thinking about our last conversation, about the way she asked if I'd ruined her mother's life and how she didn't sound angry when she said it, just tired. Before I could change my mind, I got out, walked up to the door, and knocked. A few seconds later, she opened it wearing sweats and an old hoodie, her hair in a messy bun. She blinked at me, surprised. Dad? I shoved my hands in my coat pockets. Got any coffee? She frowned, then let out a short laugh, shaking her head as she stepped aside. Yeah. Come in. I followed her inside, the place smelling like fresh laundry and something sweet, maybe vanilla. It was small but nice, lived in. Pictures on the walls, some of her, some of friends I didn't know. A life I hadn't been part of. She went to the kitchen, poured 2 cups, slid one across the counter to me. So, she said, leaning against the counter. This a social call, or you just got tired of talking to your own reflection? I smirked. A little of both. She nodded, blowing on her coffee. Mom called again. Yeah? She's mad. Says you set her up, made her lose her job. I took a sip. I didn't make her cheat. I didn't make her lie. Tina exhaled through her nose, nodding slowly. I know. We stood there for a minute, drinking our coffee, neither of us rushing to fill the silence. Then she asked, so what now? I shrugged. Haven't figured that out yet. She studied me for a second, then smirked. Well, I hear Home Depot's hiring. I chuckled. Good to know. She shook her head, smiling a little. You're a pain in the ass, you know that? I lifted my cup in a mock toast. Runs in the family. She rolled her eyes, but there was something lighter in her expression now. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I hadn't screwed everything up. A week passed and things started settling into place. Lancaster had bigger problems now. His name was popping up in the business sections for all the wrong reasons, and from what Eddie told me, his lawyers were working overtime. I wasn't losing any sleep over it. Valerie, on the other hand, was still circling, trying to figure out where to land. I got another call from Tina, this time with a little more bite in her voice. "She's staying with Aunt Carol," she said, skipping the greeting. "And she's talking about fighting you on the divorce." I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand over my face. "Of course she is. She doesn't have the money for a lawyer," Tina added. "But that doesn't mean she won't try to make your life hell." I let out a slow breath. She already did that. This is just the encore. "She's pissed about the house," Tina said. "She thought you'd sell and split it." "Not happening." She was quiet for a second. "Yeah, that's what I figured. It wasn't about money for me. I wasn't attached to the house, not really. It was just walls and a roof. But letting Valerie take one more thing she didn't deserve? Not a chance." Tina sighed. "You could just let it go, you know." "No," I said simply. She let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, I knew that was coming." I didn't bother responding. She wasn't wrong. Later that day, I met with my lawyer, a guy named Novak. Old school, grumpy, looked like he'd been carved out of granite. He flipped through the paperwork, nodding to himself before setting it down. "She's got nothing," he said flatly. "No job, no real assets, no leverage. She's not entitled to much." I waited for the but. Novak leaned back in his chair. "That doesn't mean she won't make this ugly. She might try to push for spousal support. Maybe dig for some angle to paint herself as the victim." I smirked. "She'd have to be a better liar than she is." Novak shrugged. "You'd be surprised how often the worst liar wins." I wasn't worried. The truth was on my side, and more importantly, so was the evidence. I had no intention of giving her a damn thing beyond what the law required, and even that was already grating on me. When I left Novak's office, I drove down to a small bar near the train station, the kind of place where the stools were always sticky and the bartender didn't ask questions. I nursed a beer, watching the muted news on the TV in the corner. Lancaster's face showed up again, something about his stocks dropping. I smiled to myself. "Someone's in a good mood," a voice said. I glanced up. The bartender, Pete, was watching me with an amused look. He was a stocky guy, late 50s, always smelled like cigarette smoke and cheap aftershave. "Just watching karma do its thing," I said. Pete wiped down the counter. "Yeah? Must be nice. Karma usually forgets to show up in this town." I chuckled, taking another sip. "Guess it depends on who's calling." Pete grunted. "Well, let me know next time you put in an order." I stayed a while longer, letting the noise of the bar settle over me, feeling something I hadn't in a long time: control. Everything was playing out the way it should. Valerie was out. Lancaster was drowning. And me? I was still standing. It felt good. But something told me it wasn't quite over yet. A few days later, I got the message I'd been expecting. Valerie wanted a meeting. She didn't call me herself. She had Tina pass it along, which told me two things. She still wasn't ready to face me head-on, and she thought using our daughter as a messenger might soften me up. It didn't. I agreed to meet her anyway. Not because I wanted to hear whatever excuse or complaint she had lined up, but because I wanted to close the book on this for good. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those trendy places with overpriced lattes and uncomfortable chairs. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, hands wrapped around a cup like it was the only thing keeping her steady. She looked tired, her makeup a little heavier than usual, like she was trying to hide the fact that she hadn't been sleeping. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Let's skip the small talk. What do you want?" She exhaled through her nose, shifting in her seat. "I want to talk about the house." I smirked. "No." Her jaw tightened. "Randall, No," I said again. "You don't get to screw around behind my back, take his money, live your little fantasy, and then come crawling back asking for half of what I built." She flinched at that but didn't deny it. "I just want what's fair." I leaned back, shaking my head. "Fair left the building when you did." Her fingers tightened around the cup. "I made a mistake." I laughed short and dry. "Yeah? Which part? The lying? The sneaking around? The part where you thought you were upgrading?" Her eyes flashed. "I never said that. You didn't have to." We sat in silence for a few seconds, the sounds of the cafe filling the space between us. I could see it now, how things had unraveled for her. Lancaster was done with her, that much was clear. The job was gone. The money too. And now she was looking for something to hold onto. But it wasn't going to be me. She sighed, rubbing her temple. "So that's it? You're just going to cut me off completely?" I took a sip of my coffee. "That's how it works when you burn every bridge you had." She swallowed hard, staring down at the table. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I shrugged. Not my problem. She looked up at me then, and for the first time in a long time I saw it, the realization settling in. That this was real. That I wasn't playing a game, wasn't leaving the door open. Randall, she started, but I was already pushing my chair back. We're done here, I said, standing up. She didn't try to stop me. Didn't call after me as I walked out the door. Maybe she finally understood. I stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing in the cold city air. It was over. Really over. I pulled out my phone and dialed Novak. He picked up on the first ring. Wrap it up, I said. I don't want this dragging out any longer than it has to. Novak grunted. I'll make sure she walks away with as little as legally possible. I nodded to myself. Good. I hung up and started walking. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was done. And that felt damn good. A month passed. The divorce was finalized. Novak did his job well. Valerie walked away with nothing but whatever was left in her personal account. The house, the savings, everything else stayed right where it belonged. She moved in with her sister, tried to make it seem like it was just a temporary adjustment, but I knew better. Women like Valerie didn't do well with temporary. They needed stability, control, a safety net. She'd cut all three loose the moment she thought she'd found something better. Lancaster was still dealing with the fallout of his little empire crumbling. The press had moved on to bigger stories, but the IRS didn't forget so easy. Word was he'd dumped a small fortune into lawyers trying to clean up his mess. Didn't matter. Men like him, they always thought they were untouchable until they weren't. I kept things simple. Woke up early. Took long walks. Stopped drinking like a man trying to forget something. For the first time in years, I didn't have to carry someone else's problems. I didn't have to fix things. Didn't have to be the guy standing in the wreckage, figuring out how to make it livable again. That was someone else's job now. One afternoon, I was sitting on my porch watching the world go by when Tina pulled up. She got out, leaned against the railing, arms crossed. You look like you don't hate life as much these days, she said. I smirked. High praise. She tossed me an envelope. Mom sent this. I took it, turned it over in my hands. You read it? Nope. Don't care. I nodded, tore it open, and skimmed the letter. It was exactly what I expected, half apology, half blame, wrapped up in just enough self-pity to make it sound like she was the victim. She wanted to move forward, to find a way to be civil. I could read between the lines. She thought if she played nice, maybe one day I'd forget. Maybe one day she'd be able to sit across from me at some family gathering and pretend like she hadn't burned it all down. I folded the letter, stood up, and walked to the grill sitting in the corner of the porch. Flipped open the lid, dropped the letter inside, and struck a match. It caught fast, curling at the edges, turning black before crumbling into ash. Tina watched. Guessing you're not writing back. I shut the grill. Nope. She let out a breath, nodding. Good. We stood there for a second, the smell of burning paper still lingering in the air. Then she turned, reached into her car, and pulled out a six-pack. Figured I'd stick around for a bit, she said, popping one open and handing it to me. I took it, took a sip. I won't complain. She settled into the chair next to me, stretching her legs out. So what now? I watched the street, the slow hum of traffic, the way the sun hit the pavement just right. Not sure, I said. But for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I need to have an answer. She smiled a little, took a sip of her beer. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back.